Hi, my name is Alicia Novak, and I am a part-time sociology lecturer here at UNO in the Department of Sociology. And I had the privilege of working on a research study involving human trafficking in Nebraska with OYAS last year with doctors Teresa Cooling and Dr. Christian Donia. So today we wanted to present to you an overview of our research, include some of the findings, and then also talk a little bit about the policy implications. So there are many different definitions of human trafficking, but trafficking does involve the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And human trafficking can be divided into labor or sex. For our research, we really wanted to focus on individuals from Latin American countries who have been trafficked here in the United States, specifically in Nebraska. And we really wanted to look at individuals who have an increased likelihood of vulnerability due to lack of legal status. So we focused our research on individuals who have applied for a T visa. And a T visa is a trafficking visa. This was created in 2000 by Congress with the idea of protecting victims of human trafficking as well as strengthening law enforcement's ability to investigate trafficking cases. The methodology that we used, we wanted to conduct qualitative interviews of legal representatives who have intimate knowledge of the T visa process. They really are subject matter experts and they're in a unique position to identify trafficking victims. Ultimately, we ended up interviewing 6 individuals, and that represented a total of 22 different cases of human trafficking, specifically involving victims from Latin American countries. We had 5 purposes of our study. So we wanted to look at who these legal representatives are. We wanted to describe the trafficking experience of the victims. We wanted to explore the challenges and the process of filing for a T visa, look at the role of service providers, and then also review legal representatives' perceptions of barriers to trafficking cases and ultimately how to improve those. So our findings correspond with those 5 purposes. In terms of the legal representatives that we interviewed, the 6, they all were Nebraska immigration attorneys or Department of Justice representatives. All of them are Spanish speaking to varying degrees. They have an average of 35 years old. The majority are female, half self identified as Latino or Hispanic, and the other half is white. And then this was impressive 6 years total, or excuse me, on average, of experience working with human trafficking victims, specifically from Latin America. In terms of the experience of trafficking victims themselves, the majority were from Mexico or Guatemala. This is really important to highlight. The majority of those 22 cases were labor trafficking, followed by sex trafficking. The industries that they were exploited in really mirror national patterns. So they were exploited in agricultural settings, restaurants, domestic work, and factories for labor trafficking, and then sex trafficking victims were primarily exploited in residential settings. Here are 2 quotes that I wanted to read to you that describe this human trafficking. The first one is labor trafficking case in a restaurant. So the legal representative states, and I quote, he was working these terrible hours. The fee that he was supposed to be earning from his work at the restaurant was going back to the trafficker under the disguise of you're paying off your debt. The victim was actually sleeping at the restaurant because he would open at 3 in the morning but still be there at midnight and would sleep in the kitchen to the point where the law enforcement found his bedding in the kitchen of the restaurant. Here's a quote for sex trafficking. The trafficker said the victim had to pay rent some way or another. So the trafficker would bring men over for her to sleep with in order for him to pay the rent and to pay for their living expenses. In terms of trafficking experiences, another thing that's important to highlight here is the duration. Average duration of trafficking was just short of 2 years. The gender breakdown was roughly equal. So the majority being females at 55%, males at 45%. If you break down the sex trafficking, the majority were female for sex trafficking, but equal for labor. Location, I think, is also really important to highlight. It was an even split between the trafficking occurring in urban areas or rural areas. Two themes here that I think are really essential. Um, of the 22 victims, 7 of them had actually been trafficked more than once prior to filing their T visa. So this really highlights their vulnerability. And then one of the most notable findings is that not one of the victims recognized their experience to be human trafficking, even if they knew what happened to them was wrong. So here's a quote that really highlights that. This legal representative states, I don't know that the client would have had the terminology to call it human trafficking. Talking about it would lead to feelings of it was just something really bad that happened to me, or even, and this is the most unfortunate, I think it was my fault that I ended up there. So he knew that what was happening wasn't right, but couldn't express it in terminology that would be defining human trafficking. That has really important policy implications there as well. So, in terms of the T visa process and the outcomes, one challenge that legal representatives highlighted was this lack of support from law enforcement, and that could be in obtaining a certification, which is optional for the T visa application, or even lack of support in investigating a claim of human trafficking. More information in the full report, but that might also, one of the reasons for that was this length of time that had passed, was one issue here. So in terms of collaborations, a couple of notable findings here was an inadequate funding to support services, not enough culturally sensitive providers. And they specifically mentioned counselors or therapists who speak languages other than English, so specifically Spanish or any other indigenous language. And also, and limited education of providers about human trafficking that could help screening, for example, there. The fifth section really had to do with barriers and recommendations. So that had to do with increasing these collaborative investigations, additional training on the T visa for anyone who comes into contact with trafficking victims. The fact that individuals applying for a T visa, even if they file their application currently or when the study was conducted in 2020, the wait time for a decision on a T visa was anywhere from a year and a half to 2.5 years. So legal representatives really highlighted that these individuals are still really vulnerable because they don't have permission to work. And then lastly, this discrepancy between legislative response policies and practices. What was highlighted here was this anti-immigrant sentiment. Two more that I wanted to highlight in the form of a quotation from the legal representative. Two other areas were misidentification and improving referrals. So here's a quote from a legal representative about missing identification. The trafficking was so seemingly public. This was a very commonplace. Anyone who's here in the city probably has been to it. It's a situation that I think demonstrates the many different forms, the insidious nature of human trafficking in its almost chameleon like state. Usually, people think with trafficking, there's also this assumption that the employer knows that someone is being trafficked, and this case exemplifies that. This quote is about a really positive experience, a unique experience that a legal representative noted of how improving referrals can really be beneficial. So they state the law enforcement response was what was unique. The law enforcement being really heads up about the situation, removing her from the house so that she could speak more freely and confide in them about what was going on, and then being really proactive about connecting her with services, and then being really helpful in helping her pursue an immigration remedy by completing that T visa certification. It was a really positive interaction with law enforcement. So legal providers say we need more of these types of referrals. So ultimately, we ended up with 5 policy implications or recommendations. They are as follows: increase screening across multiple agencies, provide law enforcement and immigration authorities the tools, training, and resources needed, train first responders, legal representatives, and any providers who might come into contact with these populations on the basics of the T visa. And that goes back to our point of victims not really self-identifying as being victims of human trafficking. And also the screening would help in terms of getting victims to legal representatives in order to file for a T visa, and also ensuring multiple follow-ups. And last policy recommendation is really geared at USCIS, United States Citizenship and Immigration Services. We suggest granting employment authorization while these applications are pending and to increase their discretion for what cooperation consists of. So I want to thank you all for your time. I hope that you all read the full report. I think that this type of research helps to describe the type of human trafficking that is occurring in Nebraska. I think one of the strengths of this report is that it highlights both labor and sex trafficking. And I hope that these policy recommendations really go for any Nebraskan who is interested in anti human trafficking work. We would be more than happy to field any questions or concerns that you have. Thank you all.